from the services concerning sexual and reproductive health provided by abortion providers in different states. And the closure of these centers will impact disproportionately these persons. Of course, I join my colleagues at Special Procedures at the United Nations to consider that access to safe and legal abortion constitutes a critical part of the right to the highest attainable level of health, which includes, of course, reproductive rights as well as other human rights, which include the right to non-discrimination and equality, the right to private life, and the right to freedom from torture and inhuman, cruel, and degrading treatment. Now, the methodology that I apply during my visits takes point of departure in considerations of social inclusion. And I usually will study in that connection the aspects of access to health, access to employment, access to education, housing, and the situation of violence. And unfortunately, although enormous progress has been achieved in the United States in the last 50 years, since Marsha Johnson and Sylvia Rivera threw the first bricks at Stonewall during the Stonewall riots, equality is not yet within reach, and in many cases not within sight of LGBT communities and populations in the United States. When studying the publicly available information, all outcomes in the sectors that I mentioned are inferior, and in many cases significantly inferior for the LGBT population. The LGBT population has, for example, lower outcomes in health, lower outcomes in housing. Amongst young adults aged 18 to 25, LGBT people have a 2.2 times greater risk of homelessness. 23% of LGBT adults of color have no form of health coverage. And in a recent study, 43% of LGB, that's lesbian, gay, and bisexual participants, reporting having suffered at least one act of discrimination or harassment. It was reported to me that the percentage of lesbian, bisexual, and queer women that is incarcerated is 10 times higher than the general population. So this gives you an idea of all of the work that indeed needs to be continued in relation to social exclusion and inclusion in the United States. I also think that the situation, particularly of access to health, will be marked, as I mentioned, by the regression of the overturn of Roe versus Wade. I gave some examples. And I would like to underline that lesbian, gay, bisexual persons are at a higher risk of sexual violence, and that bisexual women are 3 times as likely as heterosexuals to have a pregnancy, a teen pregnancy, and an abortion than their heterosexual peers. All of this will give you an idea of the dimension of the impact of this regression. Now, I applaud, and I will make a point in my report of making significant recognition to the current administration for the measures that have been taken in relation to seeking the eradication of discrimination and violence. In his first day of office, President Biden issued an executive order, the basic strategic thinking of which is the implementation of the Bostock judgment of the Supreme Court, which establishes that sex, the meaning of sex, under the non-discrimination provisions of the 14th Amendment need to be read as including sexual orientation and gender identity. And this has been implemented by all departments in the administration, including housing, health, and education, through a series of enormously meaningful executive orders, policy directives, memoranda, and guidance. These are very powerful, these are very meaningful developments, and I actually consider them to be conducive to addressing the situation that I was presenting in relation to the worrisome outcomes concerning social integration of LGBT persons in the United States. Now, one point that will constitute one of my findings is the LGBT population in the United States is not homogeneous, is not a monolithic block. This is a population and communities that are singularly traversed by race, by ethnicity, by migratory status, by socioeconomic status, and by particular pertinence to a population. And these are realities that place very few at top of an apex, namely white, cisgendered, gay, white men living in urban areas will be placed at top. At the bottom of this apex, of this structure, languish trans women of color, having indicators that in many cases are tenfold as low as those of the population of gay urban males. So I think that it's also very important as part of my findings to recognize that disaggregating within these populations and not actually assuming that LGBT populations references can actually cover all of the social realities is a very clear situation, which, by the way, is a consistent finding that I have all over the world. Now, in the face of this meaningful set of executive actions taken by the current administrations, my second line of finding is I am extremely concerned about a series, and I would say a concerted series of actions at state level, both legislative and administrative, that tend to base on prejudice and stigma to attack and to roll back the rights of LGBT persons. And these actions appear to be concerted on a strategy that actually refers to limitations of access to gender-affirming treatment, limitations of access to comprehensive sexual and gender education, and quite importantly, they also include the limitation of access to sports and of same-sex spaces. Now, the importance of all of these issues is that there is significant evidence produced all around the world about the beneficial aspects of all access to all of these services in relation to trans population and particularly in relation to trans youth. You may know that trans youth has actually significant higher levels of suicidal ideation, and that within the context of what has been described as a mental health emergency in the United States, the LGBT population, and in particularly trans youth, have significant risk within that context. I believe that this legislative and public policy and administrative efforts, as I said, build on stigma and discrimination. I am yet to see one of them that is fundamented on good scientific evidence. I believe that it's actually a concerted action to utilize trans lives, LGBT lives, as props in a political game that I actually think represents quite significant risks to LGBT lives and the furtherance of their human rights. I have also established some overarching issues of concern. Disproportionate impact of violence is one of them. 20.3% of hate crimes in the National Crime Victimization Survey are related to sexual orientation or gender identity bias. You would immediately see how this appears to be significantly disproportionate in relation to rates of populations that cannot be calculated exactly, but that usually are estimated to be between 5 and 8% of the population. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has found that bisexual women encounter intimate partner violence at higher rates than other populations. 46% report having been raped during their lifetime, and 74.9% reporting being victims of sexual violence other than rape. These are extremely worrying statistics that are in the context of course, a significant disproportionality also marked by race, in which, of course, I'm actually quite concerned about the situation of exclusion for LGBT populations of color. My other area of focus in this visit was the situation of LGBT asylum seekers and refugees. I have taken note of the significant intent of this administration to dismantle what I consider to be a system of discrimination being put in place by the Trump-Pence administration, including programs such as the Migrant Protection Protocols and the so-called Title 42 provisions. In this context, I have noted, however, that the dismantling of these dispositions has been rendered impossible by a series of injunctions that have been filed at local level and that have hindered the stopping of, for example, Title 42, under which it is at the moment known that over 1.8 rapid expulsions have been carried out of the United States, and some 2,500 rapid expulsions get carried out every day. I am, of course, very much mindful of the fact that administrative detention of refugees and asylum seekers is not to be used as a policy, and I am concerned that I believe significant numbers of LGBT persons that are fleeing violence and discrimination in their countries of origin are represented within these populations. I carried out 8 in-length interviews with persons with lived experience who related to me harrowing stories of suffering in their transit to the United States, and then related to me how after horrifying journeys, both at the origin and in the transit, they were placed in administrative detention for as much as 2 years, and afterwards being waiting for determination that would allow them to have permits for also another 2 years. Some of them would have been waiting as many as 7 years, which of course is coincidental with the fact that there is a reported 1.2 million pending asylum applications at the moment in the United States. Another area of significant concern is anti-trafficking programs. As you may be aware, trans women are particularly vulnerable to trafficking dynamics. And I received information from persons with lived experience and from human rights advocates to the effect that their needs are not necessarily reflected in the anti-trafficking programs that are put in place, and that they, so to speak, fall through the cracks of these programs, not being captured in an appropriate manner. This also relates to their the informality of their settings once they are placed on parole, including the fact that they have a disproportionate reliance on charities for their daily survival. The conclusion of my visit in this preliminary moment is that there are significant efforts being deployed by the current administration to dismantle systems of social exclusion. There is a concerted action that consists of hundreds of well-designed, strategically thought, designed on participative process and meaningful implementation processes in place, but a significant risk that LGBT persons will be caught in what I have described as a riptide created by all of these actions at local level. NGOs and human rights defenders have inventorized at least 280 legislative attempts at the moment at local level to create regression to the rights, and which also create a terribly polarizing narrative that exacerbates already high and worrisome risks of violence and discrimination. I will be making recommendations in this area to the United States of America in a report that I will be communicating within the next few months, and again that will be presented to the United Nations Human Rights Council in June of 2023. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's get to the questions, please.
On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you very much for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. A couple of follow-up questions. First, you said that there are 280 legislative attempts at the local level. There are 50 states here. Are these in any specific areas? Could you give us some more granular details on that? Secondly, did you run into any concerns about the implications of the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision on what might happen to gay marriage? And thirdly, how would you compare the situation today in the United States for LGBTQ people to the rest of the world? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Flatterer. Are we doing one and one? Ms. Flatterer, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Lederer. Thank you very much for those questions. The first thing that I wanted to say is that these hundreds of measures to which you made reference is actually a very fluid number, and the reason is because you may have seen that it's actually a very dynamic field. Legislations, ordinances are actually presented every day. They are being litigated at courts. They are being, in many cases, challenged and brought down by the courts. And what I am informed so far by human rights defenders and the federal government itself is that so far the trend is for the judiciary to vigorously uphold human rights and to actually deny the vigor of these legislations, of these administrative ordinances that are being presented literally every day. Now, I was, as I said, in Alabama. In Alabama, there has been dispositions actually passed to limit access to gender-affirming treatment, for example. This is under an injunction at the moment. At any moment, this may change given the dynamics of judicial action. You all may have heard of the legislation that has been nicknamed as Don't Say Gay in Florida. This is part of this pattern of legislation limiting access to comprehensive sexual and gender education, in relation to which, of course, significant litigation and political action is undergoing. There are 50 states in the United States, and what I am informed is that this type of strategy is happening in all states. Of course, there is a difference when the actions have the support of the state executive or a majority of the state legislature than when they are being brought by minority legislators or by local councils. But what is very important for me to underline is this is not only state legislations. This apparently is happening at local governments, at school boards, in administrative agencies. And again, the general trend is a limitation, a regression of rights that has the generic trend of focusing on gender-affirming treatment, of focusing on comprehensive sexual and gender education, on access to sports. And I would like to stress that typically it is not based on evidence that any of these measures need to be considered reasonably under a democratic society. You may have heard of cases in which governors actually vetoed the legislation because they realized that there were not even any trans persons that actually had requested access to sports in the state. So all of this is this very vibrant situation that has been mapped out and continues to be mapped out by my mandate in this connection. Now, you may know that the overturning of Roe versus Wade actually relied more on a question concerning the federal versus state functions, and that this, of course, has been suggested by certain actors as being a procedural aspect that could be applied to other precedent, including, of course, not only access to equal marriage or equal access to marriage, but also in a way that worries me enormously on Lawrence versus Texas, which is the last precedent that decriminalized homosexuality in the United States. And I am making a strong statement to the effect that I believe the sole suggestion that any procedural aspect could actually be used to overturn a precedent that decriminalized homosexuality De facto making gay persons criminals is unconscionable. And it is unconscionable from the point of view of international human rights law, which I would stress in a very clear manner establishes that criminalization of homosexuality is a violation of human rights per se. And this gives me a segue into your third question, which is a comparative issue. And I should say, I've always said that I'm not in the business of establishing rankings. I think that some NGOs do that, some entities do that. I don't do that, and the reason is because I actually believe that discrimination and violence against LGBT persons is actually a rather volatile thing. And countries which have vigorous protections may see them overturned quite quickly in the change of one election. And therefore, I think that this is something where we need to remain vigilant. Having said that, I would say that there is one aspect clearly, and is the situations of those countries which still criminalize homosexuality. Depending on how you look at it, given recent developments in a couple of Caribbean nations, it will be either 67 or 69. The two countries are, of course, Singapore, where the Prime Minister has announced that the criminalization will be overturned. And I believe yesterday there was a development in St. Kitts and Nevis, where the Supreme Court actually issued a finding that criminalization is against the Constitution. But let's remember that however way you count, as many as 67 countries still criminalize homosexuality, which means that as of today, 2 billion persons live in context of criminalization. And that could mean, depending on how you look at, as many as over 100 and perhaps even as many as 200 million LGBT persons that are made criminals because of where they are born. So I think that should establish to you a comparative that is actually quite objective and based on the status of protection of law.
Okay, go ahead.
Mario Villar con la agencia EFE. On the situation in the southern border that you mentioned, do you have any data on the numbers of people that are seeking asylum based on being members of the LGBT community and being prosecuted in their countries of origin? And do you have any indication that they are being discriminated when they arrive in the U.S.?
There is no official available data in relation to how many persons are LGBT seeking asylum, and this, I think, answers to two series of considerations. I would call the first one intrinsic difficulties, and it's difficulties that we see all over the world, which may include the fact that people will not necessarily be disclosing sexual orientation and gender identity. This will, of course, sometimes answer to the realities that they have faced and the stigma and discrimination that they may continue to face with persons that may surround them even at the moment. Distrust of state agencies that has been built over many, many instances in their transit and in their country of origin. These are intrinsic difficulties that we face all the time. Also, around the world, not everybody identifies under the same political identities as LGBT. Around the world, I've met many people who identify themselves over different identities, and the systems don't necessarily have the methodological nuance to capture all of this. Those are intrinsic difficulties. But I would say that in other ways, the system hasn't actually achieved seeking to have some data points or some statistic methodologies that would allow that. I believe that there are some estimations of the Williams Institute that place the number of asylum seekers and refugees in the last 5 years at some 25 to 30,000 persons. Now, within that, it's important to know that not every LGBT person or not every person affected by violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity seeks asylum on those bases, right? You may be gay and actually seek asylum on other bases, but those that seek asylum on those bases are, of course, a population within the larger context. Again, the system doesn't have the data points to gather that information. It's only what we would understand as analytical information that would allow you to look at the narratives where people are interviewed, and at that moment they disclose that these are the reasons why, or they may disclose their sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, within the systems, there are significant concerns about the way that LGBT people have undergone and experienced detention and the migration systems. And I have received significant denunciations by human rights advocates that included, for example, access to treatment, discontinuation of treatment. They also included the lack of capacity to implement differentiated measures of, for example, searching, showering, housing, and other aspects, as well as preconception and stigma as to what may be the lived realities of LGBT persons. Now, during my visit to the detention center, I was able to observe how a 2015 guideline in relation to differentiated treatment of trans persons has deployed some impact in, for example, the way in which the detention personnel manage methodological concepts as to what sexual orientation and gender identity is, what a trans person in terms of self-identification is defined as under international law, and so on and so forth. But this is in the context of a reality in which administrative detention should never be the rule for asylum seekers and refugees. And furthermore, in a context where we know that LGBT persons, asylum seekers and refugees, suffer disproportionate levels of violence. Some of the figures that I was given is that LGBT asylum seekers and refugees may be as 97% more exposed to risk than their heterosexual peers in detention, also by other detained persons. Because as I'm sure you can imagine, the detained populations repeat the stigmatizing and prejudice views and violent structures also in detention. And so this is a significant concern when it comes to these issues, and why not only I think in the logic of general international law, administrative detention is highly exceptional and determined really on a case-by-case basis, but also should be considered in the context of the exacerbated risk that is faced by LGBT persons.
Thank you for this briefing, Stefano Vaccaro, La Voce di New York. If I understand well, when you mentioned 1.2 million waiting for a political asylum, you say that you can't detect what is the percentage of LGBT, but then you mentioned a number, 35,000. That's correct? Yeah. Okay, so my other question is on, I don't want you to rank, I mean, you say that you are not there to rank countries, but after this visit in the United States, what is the country in the world, which one, that the other countries should see as an example to follow in the way they handle the issue?
Let me take the last question first. You can see that I'm thinking about it. The wheels are turning. This is an extremely complex, eradicating violence. Let me give a third attempt to that. Violence and discrimination occur in the context of deeply entrenched mechanisms. In many cases, they are institutional. We've spoken of the law that criminalizes. We know that pathologization occurred during many decades that has carved deep grooves in the awareness of the medical community, and so on and so forth. And it leads even to social perception about how LGBT persons are morally bankrupt and are lead undesirable lives, and so on and so forth. And because the mechanisms are so complex, I think the solutions are equally complex and nuanced. I spoke about the fact that populations are not completely monolithic, right? Some populations are in a situation of relative privilege within the communities and are seeking to ensure access to certain institutions that are very well entrenched in society, such as marriage, right? Access to equal marriage. Some others are fighting for survival, for everyday food and everyday hygienic conditions. And in this context, many countries around the world are adopting measures that are actually quite significant. So when I look at the current administration's strategic overview in relation to this, I think that is a case of good practice, right? I would imagine that a government that comes into place and from day one assures LGBT people that they are going to be a priority and their protection is going to be a priority, and measures are put in place in all strands of government, that is a good practice. When it comes to legislation protecting trans persons, I can give you the example of Argentina and Uruguay. They have the most sophisticated legislation in the world when it comes to gender identity. Access to legal recognition of gender identity that is simple, that is administrative, that is fast, and they also have programs providing for example, social integration in employment, including quotas for trans persons in official institutions. They also in Argentina have one of the first openly trans secretaries of state. She's not the foreign ministry, she's one of the members of the cabinet. The vice prime minister of Belgium is also a trans woman. So you have countries where political participation is clear and is presenting examples. So you can also, of course, look to those. When it looks to visibility of lesbian women, significant work is being carried out, for example, in the European context by the Fundamental Rights Agency. New Zealand is integrating questions about sexual orientation and gender identity in their census. Australian states are banning conversion therapy, as is in Mexico, as is many Mexican states, and have Canada, for example, in the whole country. So you see, what I am able to give you as an example is that for every issue, there will be good practice in every country in the world. For every issue, there's bad practice in every country in the world. And there are countries that are salient for their bad practice. I am on record in a number of cases where I'm expressing concern at legislation, at attempted legislation, at local and country level. And of course now you can count also these attempts at legislation in the context of those that I consider to be bad practice in relation to violence and discrimination. The number of asylum seekers. I wanted to be very clear because I wasn't that clear at the moment. There are no official statistics in relation to this, so we know the system yields a number of 1.2 pending applications for asylum, but there is no official data on how many of those might be LGBT persons. That's the answer to your question. Different research institutions and NGOs have created models, statistical population models, where they are trying to come up with what really is working theories as to what might be the number of LGBT asylum seekers and refugees. Now, one of those will place the number of persons within a particular asylum seeker and refugees at 10%. That typically is a number that takes point of departure in that in any population there's 6% of LGBT persons, but then you add up because typically more LGBT people seek asylum seekers because they are more exposed to violence. And so we would be leading with something like 100,000 of those persons being LGBT persons. But this is not an official statistic, and I don't think it can be considered to have any more scientific value than this, very general aspect. I mentioned one research organization, that is the Williams Institute, that carried out a statistical estimation, and this one is for the years of 2012 to 2017. So that's a particular tranche which would have placed 11,400 applications of asylum during that period. Now, please allow me to be very clear. This is not within the number necessarily of the 1.2, because this is a 5 years from 12 to 17. But that gives you an idea. And this would only be those that are based on sexual orientation and gender identity, right? So this is not necessarily telling you everyone who is LGBT, but only those that in fact claimed asylum based on sexual orientation and gender identity.
I'm sorry, just a quick follow-up. Do you have the data from which country the most of those that declare that they're seeking a political asylum, they come from?
No, I can tell you thank you for that follow-up. I can tell you that that data is not available, but I can give you a little addition there, which is we know that we have cases from all regions of the world, and that there's no particular region can be singled out as the only one that is actually creating those flows. There are significant numbers coming from the Northern Triangle of Central America, and in particular, the exacerbated violence against trans women in the Northern Triangle is a huge concern in that connection. But we know that they're coming from all regions of the world.
Okay, I see no questions online, but maybe we have time for a couple more.
Thank you for the briefing. Evelyn Leopold, Globetrotter Media. In your crystal ball, how do you see the trend in the United States? Do you see, or are you worried that those with extreme positions will have more national, state, or local positions that are prejudiced against everything, particularly LGBT?
Thank you very much, Ms. Leopold, for that question. It hasn't been very often that I get my crystal ball out these days. Allow me to answer your question in two, on the basis of two lines of thinking. The first one is that I am concerned. I am concerned about the fact that this number of actions that seek to undermine not only the progress of 5 decades of fight against violence and discrimination, but also the very significant action of the current administration to address social exclusion and violence. And I am worried because I actually think that it is these actions are capitalizing on moral fears that have been fabricated about the nature, the very moral nature of LGBT persons, which is the definition of stigma. Preconception about the moral nature of persons. And I see reappearing polarizing language that I thought had been eradicated in mainstream discourse, such as accusations of grooming and accusations of recruiting into sexual orientation and gender identity, which are, in my view, hate speech. And so to me, this concerns me greatly, and it concerns me greatly when political leaders are actually supportive of these views. I think that that concern is serious. I think it needs to be taken seriously, and I think that there needs to be an awareness campaign in which, of course, the role of media is not to be understated, to make sure that it's understood what the science and what the facts are in relation to the issues that we're talking about, including the benefits of gender-affirming treatment, the benefits of comprehensive and gender education, the social inclusion benefits of participation in sports, and the very freedom that lies at the foundation of gender identity. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think that there are reasons to be optimistic, and that is because there is clear path towards social inclusion that has been given in this country. This country is one of the points that has fed significantly the global work on eradication of violence and discrimination. It is the country that has given us political leaders elected being openly LGBT. The figures, of course, of Harvey Milk comes to mind. It's the country that has given us extraordinary research and on what the benefits of social integration. And it's the country in which great strides have been done, including, of course, access to marriage and other type of integration. So I think that there are reasons to be optimistic as far as the forces of persons that are working towards human rights and the human rights of LGBT persons are clearly concerted in moving in that direction. One of the benefits of this line of work is that I have seen social change happen over the years. I have seen countries in which decriminalization leads to social integration almost immediately. I've seen countries in which pride parades would have no more than 50 persons, and 10 years later, they have 500,000 persons. That's, of course, the reasons for my optimism. I have to say, Ms. Leopold, as a special procedure mandate holder, I usually don't use a crystal ball. I have an evidence-based approach. But thank you for your question.
One last question.
Thank you so much. Efrem Kosaifi from Arab News Daily. Quick question on Argentina. It's very curious to know how did that happen? How did it become the country with the most sophisticated protection system for LGBT? What's the driving force behind it? What's at the heart of this progress? Is it social, cultural, historical? Wonder what your insight is about this. Thank you.
It's one word: democracy. Post-dictatorial Argentina saw a process and has seen a process of vibrant social discussion around rule of law, the strength of democratic institutions, and within that context, the debt of democracy with LGBT persons. Great activists, Carlos Jauregui, Lohana Berkins, the great points of reference in the LGBT movement in Argentina, fought for democracy and carved a place in the democratic discussions, not only in relation to their particular situation, but the importance of non-discrimination for the whole democratic logic. And therefore, I think that there has been a very vibrant participative process in the whole democratic dynamic in Argentina. And that has led to significant social integration and participation in the way in which decisions are taken. And that only can benefit more inclusive, more equalitarian, and more comprehensive, more solid institutionalities. Marcela Romero, the leader of Red Black Trans, speaks often of the debt of democracy to LGBT people. And I think what she's meaning is that only democratic institutions with vigorous institutions that are independent, that rely on the rule of law, on accountability, and on participation can actually deliver true integration, true social justice, and participation. And I think that this is one of the things that I would remark all over the world, not only in Argentina, but I think Argentina is a good example.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, and this concludes the press conference, and I think the noon briefing is about to start soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.